Today we'll be studying verse by verse once again, and today the passage comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now a quick summary of the series and why we do this series and what we have been doing. The purpose of this series is really that we learn to read the Bible more thoroughly. It's easy to read many chapters a day, not always easy, but sometimes we do that and there's nothing wrong with that. But the purpose of this series is that we really learn to dig deep on sometimes a few words or a few verses. We did that with a story in the New Testament with Jesus, Mary, and Martha, and what we can learn from that. Then we looked at poetry. We looked at Psalm 1 and really took that one apart, verse by verse, sometimes word by word. Last time we looked at a letter, a personal letter from one person to another. 2 Timothy 3, what Paul wrote to Timothy and how that applies to us. So that's what we have been doing. And now today we again look at a different kind of literature. And this time we look at a story again, but this time from the Old Testament. We look at the story of David and Bathsheba. 4 verses. As you'll see in a moment, this specific story talks about sexual sin. It talks about David committing adultery with Bathsheba. Now, I want to say one thing from the very beginning. Don't get too hung up on the topic of sexual sin. See the whole topic in a much broader sense. Look at the topic at the topic of temptation. All of us are tempted. And yes, for us, some of us, it might be sexual sin where we feel weak. For some of us, it might be something else. It might be alcohol, smoking, drugs, these kind of things. For some of us, it might be bad language. For some of us, it might be something completely different. So don't look at it too much in the area of sex. Think about in what area in my life am I weak? In what area of my life am I easily tempted? In what area of my life do I easily compromise? And focus on that, and then see how what we can learn from King David applies to that particular area of my life. So that's what I want to keep you in mind from the very beginning. So let's see what these 4 verses say. 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 to 4. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in the evening that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her. For she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. That's the story, that's the passage for today. Now let's set the context straight, in case we are not familiar with it. This David is the king of the nation of Israel. He is the king of God's chosen people. This is not like the Chancellor of Germany today. This is a nation, the whole nation, its law, its society, what they did, what they didn't do. Everything was based purely on God himself. Remember Mount Sinai? That was basically the constitution of Israel. That was when God himself told the people, this is what you do as a nation, this is what you are not allowed to do as a nation. This is good, this is not good. This is what you're allowed, this is forbidden. We have a constitution today in the different countries that we are from, but the constitution back then was given by God himself. That's the nation. Now David experienced God's protection as a shepherd. Remember that he had to kill a lion, he had to kill a bear, and these kind of things. So he really experienced God from a very young age, how God was with him and how God protected him. As a very young man, he was anointed to be the next king. He was a shepherd out in the field, and suddenly the prophet came and told him, you are going to be the next king of Israel. The previous king Saul, he got jealous. He tried to kill him. And David's response to that was absolutely amazing. He had several opportunities to kill Saul and to make an end to this. And in my opinion, if I had been anointed king, I'd be like, hey, I'm doing God's will. Because God told you and me that you're not going to be a king any longer. I'll be the next king. That's what I would have thought in my own thinking. David had a very different approach. He said, I'm not going to touch the king. If God really wants me to be king, he's going to make it happen. And so even though he had the chance to kill King Saul several times, he didn't do it because he had an amazing trust in God himself. Several times in the Old and the New Testament, David was called a man after God's own heart. David experienced God in amazing ways his whole life. God showered blessing after blessing on him. David was a person who loved God, who experienced God, and who worshiped God like hardly any other person that we read about in the Old or in the New Testament. This is the man we are talking about. But even this man, on a bad day, when things went wrong, he committed this terrible sin that we just read about. Now, as I studied this text more closely over the last few years, I realized one thing. It's easy to just say like, okay, David, you shouldn't have slept with her. That was a stupid thing to do. But as I looked at these few verses, I realized David made several mistakes along the path. He didn't just have a bad day. He really took some wrong turns weeks and months before his actual fall, before he actually committed sin. And if he had avoided those mistakes in the very beginning, he would never have been in this situation where he was tempted. And the whole story would never have happened. Now, if we can talk a little bit about me, when I sin in whatever area, and I analyze it afterwards, and I think about what went wrong. Why did I do this stupid thing? When did I take a wrong turn that led me into this situation that I sinned? Too often, I have to admit, it wasn't on that day. It wasn't the day before. I started compromising somewhere a month ago. I started doing something wrong 2 months ago. And that had consequences. And then I wasn't careful. I didn't deal with the consequences. I didn't do the right thing. I didn't turn the right way again. And then because of that little compromise 2 months ago, that's why I am in this mess that I am in today. And very often, I also have to admit, the mistakes that I made are very similar to the mistakes that David did. So there's really a lot in this story that we can learn and that we can apply to our own lives as well. And that's my goal today for all of us, that we identify those early missteps so that we don't fall into sin weeks or months later. So that was the introduction. Let's take it apart. Let's look at verse 1. And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. What did he do wrong here? David didn't do his duty. The verse clearly says, it is the time for kings to go forth in battle. Who is David? He's not just a king. He's the king. He is the king of the nation of Israel, of God's people. He has the responsibility to be an example to everyone, to the whole nation, to the people in other nations, and say, this is what it's like to be a godly man. Everybody is looking at him, and because of his position, he has to live a life that represents God, that people can look at him and can say, this is a godly life. That's his responsibility because of his position. And so if it's the time for kings to go forth to battle, then the king of God's people is supposed to go forth to battle. That was his responsibility. That's what he was supposed to do. And what does he do? He sends everyone else, but he himself stays home. He tells his whole army, all his officers, all the leaders of the army, he tells them, you guys do it, but I'm going to be at home. He was not responsible at all. Now the text doesn't clearly say why. We can imagine different reasons. Maybe he was afraid, maybe he was lazy, we don't know. Maybe he trusted in his army, maybe he thought he wasn't needed. Different possibilities why he didn't go. The fact is, he didn't do his duty. He didn't do what he was supposed to do. Now here's a principle that we can get from the Bible. When we do what God wants us to do, the Bible says God blesses us. Part of that blessing that we receive is either protection from temptation or strength over temptation, to resist temptation. So when we do what God wants us to do, temptations do not play that big of a role in our lives. Now let's turn that around. If I don't do what I'm supposed to do, God removes that blessing. And if he removes that blessing, it can mean that temptations become stronger, or God doesn't give us the strength to overcome temptations. And so we set ourselves up to run into difficult situations and then having to deal with temptations on a much higher level and have much more difficulties resisting them. That's true for all of us. And that was the first major misstep that David did here. He didn't do his duty. He didn't do what he knew God wanted him to do. Let's look at verse 2. And it came to pass in an evening that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Now again, let's get the context right. David was the one, he sent everybody else off to fight. His friends, the people that he usually surrounds himself with, he told everyone else, you go out and fight the battles, I stay at home. So he set himself up to be completely alone. There was no accountability. There was no one watching what he was doing. There was nobody around him. Nobody was checking on what he did. Nobody who was watching him who could say, hey, David, be careful. There is temptation. You should stay away from that. He sent all those people away. Instead, he was simply alone. Now just imagine, would the sin have happened if Bathsheba's husband was home? Probably not. Would the sin have happened if he spent the evening with his close friends? It would not have happened. But the problem was, he sent everybody away. He was the one who told everyone, you go to battle. And as a result, he was alone. He wouldn't have had a chance to even think about or commit this sin if he had been around other people. So he was alone and he was bored. What is he doing in the middle of the night, wandering around, going on the roof and looking what's going on? What does that all indicate? He was bored. He had nothing to do. He didn't know what to do with his time. Again, because he sent everyone else off, he was just like, what do I do now? No one to talk to, no one to spend time with, no battles to fight, no one to take care of as the king. And so he just wasted his time. And he was just at home wondering, what on earth should I do next? Wandering around, he was looking for something. Now, it's not a coincidence that Bathsheba appeared at that moment in David's life. We have to be aware the devil does not have unlimited powers. God has unlimited resources, the devil does not. So when does the devil tempt us? The devil tempts us when he knows we are most weak. and the devil realized David is alone, he's bored, there's no accountability, he's looking for something, and this was his chance to say, I'm going to check if this guy can resist this temptation. And so at that particular moment, the devil sent the possibility of a temptation into David's life to say, let's see if you can handle this. We have to be aware of that. The devil tries to tempt us when we are most vulnerable. He knows it, he observes us, he studies us, and then he says, now is the time, now you're weak, now I'm bringing the greatest temptation into your life, because now I have the greatest chances to succeed. Let's think about us for a moment. When was the last few times, what kind of circumstances were there when we gave in to temptation? Was it when we did meaningful things? Was it when we were surrounded by other Christians and really focused on God? Or was it when we were alone and bored and had nothing to do? I think we all know the answer. 95% of the time it's when we are alone, when we are bored. David fell in his own trap because he sent everybody else to battle, and because he stayed home. He set up the circumstance for him to be alone and bored, and then to face that temptation. That was